Hi guys, hello and welcome back to my channel Elucidate. And guys, today we are going to understand a very important topic, which is what is kernel in operating system, and this is also a prerequisite for your entire Docker series. Why today I'm saying that it's gonna be a prerequisite for your entire Docker series? Because something happened. So what happened was that, guys, we were taking an interview for a particular DevOps guy who was having around 7 to 8 years of experience, and we just asked one simple query that can we run Windows containers directly on Linux machine? But the answer that we got from that particular guy was not what we expected to that level of experience, right? And later on I found that people get tend to get confused that they still do not have a basic idea of what an operating system is all about, why kernel is being used, what kernel is all about, what are the tasks and functions that are being performed by the kernel of an operating system, and why shell is being used, right? So that guy got confused, and he totally went off the grid. We asked that particular guy to please create a container onto Windows and try to run it onto Linux, and then create on Linux, try to run it on Windows, and why it is running, why it is not running. So in order to give answers or to crack interviews like these are the very basic questions. Those who know the answer, but those who do not know, you need to understand this first, because if you do not know this particular concept, it would be difficult for you to move ahead onto your Docker journey, right? So first we need to understand why kernel is being used. First, I'll just go through this particular things, and then we'll explain, right? So guys, if hardware of our system wants to communicate with the applications that are present onto our system, so applications may be Netflix, MS Teams, Google Chrome, a VLC media player. These are the applications that are installed onto our computer system, right? And if the hardware of our system wants to communicate with them, then how it will communicate, the way or the track which it will follow to communicate with the Google Chrome application or MS Teams or Zoom application, how much memory it is going to allocate to all these applications, how much storage it is going to allocate, how much ROM it is going to allocate. So all these sort of resource management is totally handled by the kernel, and the location or the mode into which a kernel works is known as kernel mode. There are two types of mode: one is user mode and kernel mode. Not going into deep, just try to understand that there is a kernel which basically takes care of all these things, right? And there is a shell part also. And what and why this particular shell is being used, first of all we need to understand it with the help of this particular diagram. Let's quickly go through it. Okay, suppose this is your hardware, and your hardware, we all know what hardware is all about. Hardware of your computer system, right? Just above it there is a layer known as a kernel, right? And on top of kernel there is a shell, and the combination of kernel plus shell is known as an operating system. So you can say that on top of your hardware, like you go to a particular Reliance showroom or any other showroom, and you order or that we want this particular configuration of our hardware, we want it x number of RAM, x number of storage capacity, terabytes of RAM, I mean 450 GB of hard disk. So X number of things can be your hardware. You can consider it, right? Or your input output devices, peripherals that are connected. So if your hardware wants to communicate with your user, user is like me myself. If I want to communicate, if I want to open this Google Chrome, if I want to make use of this application, then how it is going to open, how much memory it is going to take. If I am clicking onto this MS Teams app, which is present over here, how much memory it is going to take, how much storage it is going to take, what would be the ROM, right? What would the CPU allocation? So all these things are closely monitored by the kernel, right? Kernel totally works onto a secluded mode. Secluded mode means it totally works into an isolation. You cannot disturb the processes that are going on onto the kernel, right? This is kernel is kept totally isolated. This is a very isolated part of operating system. Okay, and on top of kernel there is a shell. A shell, why it is known as shell, why this name is given shell? Shell basically means an outer covering. Okay, so why it is outer covering, we call it because it is directly in touch with the users. Okay, and kernel is in touch with the hardware. So what happens onto a shell? In shell what happens that you type something, you type some commands like ping google.com, or like netstat or ipconfig. So these are the commands that you type in via shell, right? But kernel will not understand your high level language. I'll quickly demo it out to you guys over here, right? Give me just 1 minute, I'll just demo it to you. So guys, over here you can see that I just wrote a command known as ping google.com. So ping is a command, right? Ping google.com, when I wrote it, it started giving me certain results onto this particular fashion, right? So this is my command line interpreted, right? So what happened over here is that when I wrote a command named as ping google.com, so kernel won't be able to understand these all these commands that are written in high level language, right? So the commands can be like ping google.com, netstat, you can also write ipconfig, and number of commands can be there, right? So your kernel won't be able to understand, because kernel can only understand the language that have been typed in or into binary or machine level language coding, right? So why shell is being used? Since kernel cannot understand the commands written in high level language, kernel only understand binary or machine level language, right? So shell basically acts like a command line interpretation. So whatever we type in, that is all our high level language command that are typed in over here, they will get converted into a binary form, and that binary form or machine level language would be able to be easily understandable by the kernel, right? And after that, once kernel understand what the user has typed, what it is talking about, then kernel will provide the access to the hardware once it understands the request in the binary form, right? So so what happened, let's say I just the way I just opened the shell over here. Let's say if I have written that ping google.com, ping command is not understandable directly by the kernel. The CLI will simply, shell will simply convert it into a machine readable format, which only kernel can understand. Once kernel understands that it is saying that ping google.com, or any other command, or like ls ipconfig, any other things, it will then further go and interact with the hardware, or it will make a request to the kernel. Shell is going to make request to the kernel that I want to ping it, or I want to access certain things, or xyz, whatever it may be, right? Then kernel will be able to understand, because it got converted into the language which kernel can understand, and that was basically done by the shell. Okay. And then kernel will revert uh, to the shell, and then whatever the outcome would be there will be displayed over there, right? And then user will get to know that yes, something happened. Like in my case, this is what user get to know, that if I you run simply this particular command like ping google.com, and number of things you will be getting in form of response, right? So this is what basic the idea is all about, that if users want to interact with the application, they need to interact with the operating system, right? And operating system is now further divided into two parts, which is kernel is closely linked and attached with the hardware portion. It totally encapsulates it. Whatever is going on within your entire computer system is being handled by the kernel, right? If your kernel is not functioning, your system won't work properly. Okay. And if user wants to type in via command line interpretation, then shell is being used, right? If you type certain commands like ipconfig is written in english language cannot be understood by the kernel. So shell will simply convert it into an readable format, which is being easily read by the kernel, and then kernel will provide shell the access whatever it was asking about, right? And then it comes back to the user over there, and user can interact. So this is a very 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 simple flow and diagram, with the help of which we can actually understand why kernel is being used and what shell is all about. And what is an operating system? Operating system, guys, is nothing. It's just an interface between your hardware and your user, so that a proper communication can be made, right? Let's say if I am a Russian guy, I want to talk with a French guy. I cannot communicate to a French guy directly because I do not know French language. Simply, French guy cannot communicate directly to me because he doesn't know the Russian language or the American language or English, Hindi, Hebrew, right? A number of languages. So for that, we need some sort of a person or a mediator. If I say something in English, that English language would get translated back into the Russian language or French or German or any other language. In the same way, this is how operating system works, right? It is simply provides an interface between the hardware and the user. I am a user. I am clicking on Google Chrome. Google Chrome got opened. How it got opened? All of this part was handled by the operating system. And operating system and how you interact with the operating system, there are two different ways, right? One, with the help of GUI. Like your Windows is a totally GUI based kind of stuff, right? You do not have to make use of keyboards a lot, right? If you have a mouse, you can simply click over here, this will open. If you have a mouse, you can click it over here, this will open, which simply means that there are icons or there are some graphical things are being presented, right? You do not have to type some commands in order to access them. If I want to access a Google Chrome, I'm not typing any commands over here, right? Like access Google Chrome kind of stuff, and then I'm doing some sort of you know read write activity, and then providing and changing the file and location. And so this is not the way. I do not need to have any understanding of any language, right, in order to communicate properly. So this is a totally a graphical user interface with the help of which you interact with the operating system. Another way which I showed you was this particular part, in which you can type in something. I am tapping it, and I'm accessing this particular system with the help of certain commands, right? See, this is how it works. I navigated to this folder, and now I observed that this folder is containing some file named as untitled document. So now I hope this diagram is making some sense, at least some sense. If not fully, at least you guys are able to understand what is all going all about, right? So if I want to, as a user, want to interact with the hardware, it needs to first interact with the operating system, and operating system will simply help the user to interact with all these applications, because all these applications, Chrome, Teams, Netflix, VLC, are installed over your operating system. If you want to run this onto your hardware, if I want to run Google Chrome on my hardware, then operating system will come into play. Then kernel will decide that Google, since it is a Google Chrome, then kernel will say that I will allocate at least 400 MB of RAM or 5 or 1 GB of storage should be there in order to run this. If it does not meet your criteria, you won't be able to run this onto your hardware. So this thing we need to know, right? So guys, if somebody asks you that, can we directly access the hardware of the computer system? No, you can never directly access hardware of your computer system. You need to interact with the operating system, and operating system is now further divided into your shell part and your kernel part. Okay. So guys, this was all about this particular lecture, but the important thing, why this thing was even made, why this lecture was even made, was because of this particular query. So when we asked that particular guy that can we run Windows container or Linux machine, the answer is present onto this particular section. So that's clearly, please very look have a very close look onto this diagram that I've made. Right. Let's suppose I have a Windows machine over here. Okay. Onto that Windows machine, I have installed an operating system. That is, sorry, it was Windows hardware. So I've installed a Windows operating system. So this is my Windows operating system, and my operating system also contains a Windows kernel as well, right? Okay. So these are the two things that I have tried to depict over here. So now if I install Docker over here, so the answer to that question I'm giving it now, that too in very high level language. I'm not going into very deep because this is not a lecture of a Docker. Okay. So if you create a container, that is built on your window that you create. That is, if you create a Windows container, it will use Windows host operating system, right? So Windows, like Windows is an operating system, it will use the host OS kernel. So it will use the kernel of the Windows. Again, back to this particular diagram, if it is like a Linux operating system, it will use the kernel of the Linux. If it is Mac OS, it will use the kernel of the Mac OS, right? So this is what it means over here. So if you create a Windows container, it will run simply using Windows OS kernel. And if there is a Linux container you want to run on Windows, so they will be able to run, you will be able to run all the Linux container onto Windows. Why? Because Windows is providing you a service known named as WSL, right? Which is the full form is like Windows Subsystem for Linux. So this is a service which is being provided by the Windows, as a result of which you are able to run all your Linux container onto Windows. But you cannot run your Windows container on Linux, because Linux is not providing any other services like WSL kind of stuff, like which Windows is providing. If Linux would have provided services like this kind of stuff like Windows is providing, then only you could have run all your Windows container directly on Linux machine, right? And if you want to still run, then onto your Linux machine, you have to install a Windows virtual machine onto your Linux host, right? And now that will further allow you to run Windows container. So Windows container, if you want to run on Linux, you need to install Windows virtual machine, and then uh, you can go about that, right? But you cannot directly run, guys, a Windows container on Linux machine. Linux can be run on Windows. Again, the reason being because Windows is providing you a service with the help of which you can, run Linux containers. But Linux is not providing any such services. So this was the reason that guy, since didn't knew about these very basic concept, what kernel is all about, what are the functionalities of kernel, what kind of service Windows is providing in order to run the containers, is Linux providing any other services like WSL kind of stuff. So if you do not know what shell is all about, what kernel is all about, what is an OS, then it's, guys, I know people simply learn the definition and they say that it only uses host OS kernel and that kind of stuff. Like the way I've written over here, it is using host OS kernel. But what do we mean by host OS kernel? What is actually kernel is? What is the functionalities of a kernel? If you ask somebody, people tend to get confused. So this is the reason why I have created this particular video in order to bring about some information or knowledge to you guys, so that whenever you go for these kinds of interviews, you do not get stuck. Now kernels are of different types, like monolithic, microlithic. There are two three more kernels, so I'm not going into deep. I'm just trying to make this topic a very easy and very on a lighter note, so that you do not need to go into very deep, because nobody will ask you that what is the structure of monolithic kernel, what is the structure of microlithic kernel. Only just you need to understand that why shell is being used, what shell actually does, why kernel cannot understand high level language. Since it cannot understand, so this is the reason why shell is being used. It simply converts it into a machine readable format. You just need to tell this particular thing. You cannot directly access your hardware of your computer system. And OS is required. OS now formally contains two parts. One is kernel part, one is shell part. Kernel manages all these things: storage, communication, memory allocation, resource management, CPU allocation. These kind of stuff you need to just know. And the application that are installed over your operating system, when you users want to interact them, they can interact with the help of shell. Shell, you can type your some command in the form of English language. It is a command line interpreter, and then shell will make a request to the kernel that I want to access this resource. Then kernel will decide how much allocation will be should be given to these all these things. If you want to install it, then you have to write a particular command like apt install chrome stable version, that kind of stuff. Then everything goes on, and then it gets back to the kernel. Then kernel provides some response in again to the shell, and then it gets back onto a readable format to the user, right? So guys, this was all about this particular lecture. This is the reason why I created this lecture, that what is kernel and operating system. And guys, again, coming back to this question, you cannot directly run Windows container onto your Linux machine. Linux containers are running onto Windows because Windows is providing you a service known named as WSA. You can Google it out. You can check it out even in more details at this point of time. But for those who are starting the new journey onto your Docker series, just try to. We will cover each and everything into very, very, very detail, and that too in a very low level manner. Right, guys? I will be going into very deep diving in all every concepts of Docker. Although we have, at this point of time created a lot of Docker sessions, but this was required because I saw that person, getting stuck, having a lot of experience and not knowing what kernel is all about. So, guys, I hope I have not taken your much time. Now, I would like to take leave. And thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. And I wish all of you a very healthy and very happy life. Please make sure that you stay safe, everybody of you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.